Thank you, Allison. It sounds like we got a ton of leaders in the room. It's an honor and a pleasure as one leader who loves to lead and talk about change, to be in a group that represents such an impactful group for our state here in Michigan, and in an environment that is ever changing. It was this way well before the pandemic, and it's been accelerated since, right? The trends within the environment in which we operate demands more agility and quite frankly, change-friendly organizations. More leadership from more people, not just top management or those who have hierarchical power, and more strategic sophistication. And most basically, a much greater capacity to execute bold or transformational initiatives rapidly while minimizing the size and number of bumps in the road that slow us down. So my hope today for this discussion is folks allow themselves to be a little bit vulnerable, that they will listen, that you'll listen to what I have to say. You'll try it on for size, and throughout this conversation, let's talk in real time about what makes sense and what doesn't. As I shift here, so walking through how we're going to use the next hour to hour and a half, we're going to start with an overview, setting up for our topic, which is change, leading change, and quite frankly, transformational change. We'll then transition to dive a little bit deeper into the realities of what we have to face, how we survive it, and ultimately how we thrive with it, with new skills. And in the end, I'm going to highlight some of the elements and practices we can do to address those challenges of our new reality. And then at the end, I will attempt to leave plenty of time for question and answer. As we work through the overview and the reality sections, I ask that we keep our questions to clarifying understanding. As we move into the putting into concepts, you're welcome to share specific instances or issues you're facing, and we can begin to shape those together or really just answer anything that's on your mind. This is your time, and I want to treat it as such. And so this is how we're going to use our time together. I'll start by setting the context, who I am, who I'm representing, and the focus of our conversation. And then we're going to spend some more time diving into the heart of the presentation, relative to some key facts about our environment, the journey that we must travel, and the leadership skills that are necessary to help put us on the most successful path for putting what we're talking about into practice. All right. So let's walk through our overview. As Allison highlighted, I'm a member of the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness Board. I joined in 2020, and since that time, have worked mainly internally on a number of initiatives, chairing our communications committee at one point and championing our now current strategic plan. In addition, I work with a company called Guidehouse. It's a global management consulting firm, really providing services to both public and commercial markets. However, I focus in on state and local and support state and local governments. Our tagline is outwit complexity, and really this just acknowledges that of all the world's problems, they're big and they're complex, and success is really founded on trust. And that you can't do it alone. And really all we can ask for is to have a seat at the table. Because these problems we have to address, similar to homelessness, is going to take the entire village, not one entity, one organization, or let alone one person. And so a little bit about myself. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Michigan State University. Go Green. Rough year. Let's not talk about it. Early on in my career, I focused much on behavioral and mental health. I ran a fledgling crisis intervention nonprofit for a number of years before moving into the space of community participatory evaluation. And since that time, over the last about 8 to 9 years, I feel like I've evaluated just about any publicly funded program type there is, from after school programs to implicit bias trainings to large scale rehousing initiatives and everything in between. I spent some time in public health and MDHHS, and really that's where I began to first become engaged with the concept of large-scale transformational initiatives. I joined the Division of Environmental Health about 1.5 years post Flint water crisis. And at that time, the toxicology section had received a massive amount of funding to scale up its operations and meet needs that weren't being met. And a lot of my job was supporting that scaling. Since then, I've worked at Guidehouse for about 3 years now, supporting from setting strategic strategies on how to respond to the pandemic, all the way through execution and standing up large-scale community grant programs. In addition to that, focusing on evidence-based policymaking and budgeting, which is about making better use of our public funded dollars and making sure they're going towards what works in the most impactful way. But before we dive much further, I want to get a sense of some of the changes that you're observing in your communities and your organizations. We're in a great time of change, warp speed innovations, changing how we work, shop, socialize, live. Millions of people are rethinking their careers. Businesses are scrambling to meet new expectations, and cultural shifts have given us new words, new relationships, and a new awareness. And of course, we've long been grappling with the pandemic. But while these big things, they're felt, these are all big things, they're felt in small and very personal ways. We're asking ourselves heavy questions about what we desire, where we find opportunity, and what we're willing to sacrifice. And so I have an assumption that some of you are currently observing or have observed major changes or minor changes in your organization and community. And so I'd like to just popcorn around for those who feel comfortable sharing a change that they've witnessed or are witnessing. And you are welcome to come off mute. Amy? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I work for an advocacy agency in Grand Rapids, Michigan called Link Up.
I love it.
And what I've noticed in the Grand Rapids area is a lot more advocacy agencies popping up and just grassroots agencies, because so many social service agencies are overwhelmed due to the housing crisis in general. And we're just trying to motivate citizens on what they can do to empower themselves in order for voices of the marginalized people to be heard, and how to best communicate to the people who are making decisions on how to make appropriate changes, because it seems like the voices are going unheard. And so how to best train people to be their own advocate. And so that's what Link Up is doing, and just trying to get all those agencies, all those groups, all those citizens to know that they have power and a voice. And I love Link Up for that in the Grand Rapids area. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm hearing two things. One's a major one, which is the housing crisis that's stricken most of our, if not all of our cities. And in addition to that, new organizations coming to life within our communities at the grassroots level. Okay. What are some other changes that have occurred in your organization? I'm seeing in the chat, staff turnover is still very high. Okay. Increase in the volume of work and fewer persons to do it. Noticing it's not just at the leadership level, but also direct line staff. Increase in burnout and turnover. It's harder to hire staff willing to do the more difficult jobs, like working in a shelter and on the front lines. Rents are so high, homelessness numbers are rising. Staff are unwilling to dig in and do what it takes. Okay. Looking for one more. We'll do one more. To my personal growth plan to get more comfortable sitting in silence. So I appreciate the stretch goal here. And those are some major things. And we're going to dive some more into that element because I think this work and around change and the constant change is actually directly related to this burnout element that we're feeling and experiencing in our organizations. You know, one thing's true, which is that all of us will have and will continue to experience change that has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the world. That means changes in our friendships, our families, and our homes. You know, our life exactly as we know it really does not exist in the same way and will not in a few years. It's a guarantee. That's how it works. And that's going to be a through line message, a hard message to set. But as we kind of continue down this change leadership journey, there's a mindset shift about embracing change that we've got to sit with. And my hope is that we're going to unpack that even more here today. All right. So change, is it good or is it bad? You know, change within organizations and within society seems to always follow the same cycle. Phase one, and this could be in the context of operating your organization differently. It could be changes in major changes to an agency that you partner with on a regular basis. It could be changes in funding. But things always seem to follow a cycle of we panic and we feel a little bit disenfranchised by said changes. Phase two, we start to begrudgingly adapt and start doing new things. Phase three, we start to view the new circumstances as our quote unquote new normal. And then phase four, we reach a point where, like the new way, we can't look at the world any differently. It's the way we operate, and it's the way we sort of quote unquote always have. It's not inherently good or bad, but the key I want to highlight is oftentimes, regardless of how we feel on the back end of the change or what we feel as leaders, maybe commissioning said change, it's often received from the start as bad, regardless of the intentions behind it. There's some examples I like to highlight that really drive this home, right? So, for example, the ice industry began with people literally chopping ice out of lakes in the winter and then storing it for summertime sales. And then those same people demonized the new refrigeration industry. Once machines were able to make ice all year round, they simply couldn't envision how refrigeration would revolutionize the food industry, giving many more people the opportunity to work in it. The movie industry at one point opposed the VCR, thinking it would destroy theater attendance. Instead, it birthed a vital new source of revenue for those movie studios. the examples like this are endless. People opposed mirrors because they thought it would make people too self-centered and vain. People opposed pencil erasers because kids would become careless with their handwriting, and people opposed watches because they felt that time would become too addictive. My favorite being that in 18th century England, a time and place in which umbrellas were strictly taboo. In the minds of most British individuals at that time, umbrella usage was symptomatic of weakness of character, particularly among men. And all of these things at one point in time, for longer, we're not talking about, a day or two or a week or a trend. We're talking about for years, all these things that we now see as normal were vehemently opposed at one point or time. And so now you look at us today and we're a product of all these changes. The clothing we wear, the lifestyle we choose, the music we listen to, the technology we use, and the places we go, the words we use, all of this was once new and therefore scary and therefore opposed by previous generations. All of it represented change. All of it was considered bad. But do we think we're bad? Of course not. We think we're good. We're made up of all the good things, the familiar, the comfortable, the necessary things, the things we grew up with, the things we understand. And then when it comes to us, we instinctively recoil and say, no, you can't change this. These are all of the good things. This is all to say that the changes that come about in our organizations and in our society will follow this cycle of reactionary panic, adaptation, a settling in of the new normal, and then we reach a point where we couldn't even imagine reality without this. And so I want to seed that because this is a key element that's going to carry through throughout the rest of today's conversation. And so why is it important that we invest, that we're here, right? Why did Alice and I talk about this particular training topic? It's because the problem we're seeking to address is so dang wicked, right? We're not just dealing with straightforward issues in the housing and homelessness space. It's not a tame issue. Tame issues have clear solutions. Instead, we're up against what are known as wicked problems. These are complex challenges without straightforward resolutions, often involving many stakeholders and interconnected factors such as economic, race, society, the environment, educational system. Understanding the nature of these wicked problems is crucial for change leaders because it helps us in strategizing holistic and strategic solutions. More importantly, when we try to implement new organizational policies or practices or God forbid, try to change the culture, we often encounter complexity themes, right? 6 of which you see represented here on the screen. In this new way of working, we're trying to keep up with integrating technology developments for digital transformation. We're trying to make sure that we're creating the right context for employees to maximize their potential. We're up against needing to achieve an alignment with a far more diverse and multicultural organizations than we've had in the past. And in addition to that, fostering this collective intelligence and inclusion within our organizations so that folks are bought in to where the entire organization is going. These complexity challenges, some key ones that we're up against include resistance to change, the data and information complexity, Systems thinking often requires a deep understanding of complex data, information flows within an organization, ambiguity and uncertainty, and organizational silos, especially those of us who work in the state and local realm. By any objective measure, the amount of significant and often traumatic change in organizations has grown tremendously over the past few decades. As fast and furious, uh, constant change takes root in our everyday work lives, putting pressure on both our organizations and the individuals to adapt or perish. We all have the option to either keep our heads down and mouths shut, or we can choose a willingness to take the risk necessary to execute changes rapidly while minimizing the size and number of bumps in the road. And so let's start talking about leadership here. And I want to start by differentiating and be very clear on how I'm defining leadership for the sake of our conversation here today. I view management and leadership are two distinct but complementary systems of action within an organization. So put simply, managers are often tasked with ensuring that the current system works as effectively as possible, whereas leaders are focused on moving people towards a new set of beliefs, values, or oftentimes a new vision for the future. Management is a set of processes that can keep a complicated system of people and technology running smoothly. The most important aspects of management include planning, budgeting, organizing, staffing, controlling, problem solving, whereas leadership is a set of processes that creates organizations in the first place. It adapts them to significantly changing circumstances. Leadership defines what the future should look like and aligns people with that vision and around that vision, and then inspires them to make it happen despite the obstacles. The best definition for leadership was given to me by a seventh grader in a Flint community school during an evaluation project where we were asking them and inquiring on a youth voice project what principals' roles were. And we asked them to define leadership. And seventh grader said to me, a leader points in the direction that everybody needs to go and then tells them to hurry up. And succinctly, that's it. For most of a century, as we created thousands and thousands of large organizations for the first time in human history, we didn't have enough good managers to keep all of our bureaucracies functioning. So as a result, organizations, companies, and universities developed management programs. And hundreds and thousands of people were encouraged to learn management on the job. And they did. People were taught little about leadership. To some degree, management was emphasized because it's easier to teach than leadership. But even more so, management was the main item on the 20th century agenda because that's what was needed. For every social entrepreneur or business builder who was a leader, they needed hundreds of managers to run their ever-growing organizations. The same can be said for our state and local governments. Unfortunately for us today, the emphasis on management has often been institutionalized in organizational cultures, and which inherently, I believe, discourages employees from learning how to lead. Ironically, past success is usually the key to producing this outcome. But when we get into the really drilled down on change management versus change leadership, almost everyone thinks about the problem here as one of managing change. But successful leadership, it's estimated that 70 to 90% is the result of leadership, whereas only really 10 to 30% is the result of management. and that's for many reasons. Um, but for large organizations or larger organizations, keeping the ever larger organization under control becomes the primary challenge. Attention turns inward, and managerial competencies are nurtured with a strong emphasis on management, but not leadership. Bureaucracy and an inward focus really take over. The problem often goes unaddressed, and a unhealthy arrogance begins to involve. All these characteristics then make any transformation effort that much more difficult. And this is often due because arrogant managers can over-evaluate their current performance, their organization's performance, or their competitive position. They listen poorly and learn slowly. And inwardly focused employees have a difficulty seeing the very forces that present threats and or opportunities in the environment in which they work. So bureaucratic cultures can really smother those who want to respond to the shifting conditions. And the lack of leadership leaves no force inside these organizations to break out the morass. The combination of cultures resistant to change and managers who have not been taught how to create change is pretty lethal, right? For example, sources of complacency are rarely addressed adequately because urgency is not an issue for people who have been asked all their lives and their careers to maintain the current system like a softly humming Swiss watch. A powerful enough guiding coalition with sufficient leadership is not created by people who have been taught to think in terms of hierarchy and management. Managing change is important. There are budgets and plans that need to be laid. There's organizing and staffing that move any change or transformation forward. And ultimately, there's some control and problem solving needed. But without competent management, the transformation process or any change process can get out of control. But for most organizations, the much bigger challenge is leading said change. Only leadership can really blast through the many sources of what I like to call organizational inertia. Only leadership can motivate the actions needed to alter behavior in a significant way. And only leadership can get change to stick by anchoring it in the very culture of the organization. So as we'll talk today, and as you'll see, leadership often will begin with one or two people, you all. But in anything, but the smallest of organizations, that number needs to grow and grow over time. The solution to the change problem is not one of a larger than life individual who charms thousands of obedient followers, right? Modern organizations like ours are far too complex to be transformed by a single giant. And so many people need to help with this leadership task, not by attempting to imitate the likes of Winston Churchill or Martin Luther King Jr., but by modestly assisting with the leadership agenda within their spheres of activity. And so the key takeaway here is both management and leadership are needed. Management and change management produces a degree of predictability that is necessary to maintain results and maintain the initiative. However, leadership produces said change, and ultimately to a dramatic degree. And we all have a role that we can play in leadership or leading any change within our organizations, regardless of our hierarchical status. And so, as we kind of transition here, this is just this idea that we all start with a current state of where we are in the moment, and we have a vision for the future. That vision might be increasing the service quality that you provide in some way. It might be related to a technology integration. It might be a change in your community of how you serve the folks that you serve. But the reality is it's not a linear track. There are deviations in this journey, and that's part of what we need to control for. Transformation related challenges as a leader, you can break it out into three core areas. You've got to manage or lead through the journey, leadership skills, and then the environment. First thing we've got to ask ourselves is what's unique about the environment that we're attempting to navigate, and what are we experiencing? We need to plan for said journey. Oftentimes, things we want to change start with the future state of, hey, this is where I want us to go, without taking a full catalog of where your organization currently is, right? Because if you do that, you can then begin to assess what resources are needed and who else should you bring into your coalition. In addition to that, you have to ask yourself, what does your team need skill-wise to help guide it through the transformational journey? And what do we need to cultivate within our own team to maintain our resilience? And so we're going to begin to break down what the reality of our operating environment is. But before I do that, I just want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions related to the historical anecdotes and or management versus leadership dichotomy that I highlighted. All right. All right, so let's start with the environment. So I'm going to introduce something here that's the core of what we're going to talk about today, which is VUCA. VUCA is a framework that you can leverage for strategic thinking and planning. It's an acronym that describes 4 distinct types of challenges that we face in our modern world, in our environment. There's volatility, which refers to the speed, volume, and magnitude of change. There's uncertainty, which points to the lack of predictability of issues and events. There's complexity, which involves the multiplicity of factors and interdependencies of our communities and the systems in which we work in. And then there's ambiguity, my least favorite. Ambiguity means the haziness of reality and the difficulty in understanding what is happening and what it means. Now, the term VUCA was first introduced by the U.S. Army War College in the late 1980s, following the end of the Cold War. It was used to describe the more complex and turbulent and unpredictable world that emerged after the collapse of the USSR. But since then, VUCA has been adopted by leaders and organizations across the globe to characterize the often challenging conditions under which we have to make decisions, plan for the future, manage risks, foster change, and solve complex problems. And so the first step to becoming a leader of change is embracing what I will be referring to as the VUCA mindset. Embracing a VUCA mindset means shifting from a desire for certainty and predictability to an acceptance of the fluid nature in which the world operates. It challenges us to become more innovative, more agile, and adaptable. It encourages us to build resilience and flexibility into our systems and into our processes. And most importantly, it helps us prepare for the future, whatever it may hold. And so let's unpack that a little bit more. And I keep looking over because I checked the chat, see if there's anything there. All right. So these four elements that I described are the challenging conditions. So let's dive into a little bit of each. You know, to tackle a challenge, you first got to know the characteristics and its impacts. And some of these, I can tell from the initial comments and the questions, you're already observing in your own organizations. Volatility, let's start there, is characterized by the rapid pace of change that is unpredictable and outside our control. The effects, it often leaves staff and people feeling overwhelmed, anxious, and stressed with a fear that we are not adequately prepared for what's coming next. Moving to uncertainty, we find ourselves inundated with information, which often leads to analysis paralysis. We can also have the inverse of that, where we just don't have any information, but we're being forced to make a decision. We experience breaks in our workflow, and it can be hard to fully describe our current state and predict the outcomes, which often makes us react and act slower. Complexity refers to the intricate interconnections in our systems. So with this, we struggle with the cause and effect of numerous factors, right? The systems elements that, you know, the job market impacts or economics impacts homelessness impacts the dual nature of everything having a bi-directional relationship causes an increasing amount of complexity in what we do. This complexity can lead to confusion, difficulty in establishing a clear state, start, and endpoints of various efforts, and challenges in managing rather than simply solving problems. And then lastly, we have ambiguity. It's the haziness we encounter, the lack of clarity. Ambiguity left unaddressed over time often leads to anxiety. And anxiety left untouched over time will lead to frustration. And so, you know, this is the result or its impacts is the often results in less formal reporting structures. It can make us feel untethered, directionless, hesitant, and sometimes leading to overreaction or underreaction. That's a key product of an ambiguous environment. And so understanding VUCA is really the first step to tackling these challenges. You know, for y'all, VUCA can be used, as I stated at the beginning, a frame of strategic thinking and planning, right? It's intended to compel leaders to adapt by being more flexible with plans and strategies, to invest in foresight and foreseeing by anticipating challenges that could arise, navigating ambiguity by developing multiple scenarios for decision making, understanding by deep diving into the complexity of situations, and clarification by maintaining clear communication, providing context. You know, it isn't just a set of problems, it's a set of conditions. And these are non-negotiables. These are in our lives in some way or another, really at all times. And so this environment is a real pain, and new leadership skills are required that enable us to deal with change. In my job at Guidehouse, we boil this down to really 6 areas where leaders need to begin to increase their commitment for development. One is empathy, ensuring that there's problems worth solving and how to make connections back and communicate that to your staff and your organizations. Increasingly relying on global insights, right? So no longer long are the days where we just begin to make decisions by using the information inside our organizations. Now we're connected to networks like the one provided through Micah, or stakeholder engagement, participatory efforts, grassroots organizations, and even other states, countries, via that internet. In addition, embracing experimentation, which we'll talk a little bit about today, using visuals to communicate complexity or communicate changes and impact, and then cross-functional teams, making sure that we have diverse representation in expertise and skill sets at each of our tables. All right. So now on to the journey. So I refer to this as, well, they call that the pit of despair. But this is really the pain. The pain of change comes through the pit of despair, is what this graphic is intended to highlight. You know, our leadership role, your role, is to help reduce the pitch, the depth, and the time of it. You know, this illustrates the emotional and practical journey that organizations and the people that make those organizations up often experience during transformational change, particularly in a VUCA environment. So early on here, as we embark on any change, there's an initial phase of high expectations. Anybody who's ever pitched or wrote a grant knows exactly what I'm talking about. Promises sold, not always promises delivered, right? But there's a high level of energy and expectations after a change initiative is signed off on. Usually everyone is optimistic and the future seems bright, and our stakeholders are on board and the mood is positive. However, the realization and despair begins as we progress. The complexity of the change you're moving forward becomes apparent. This is where the reality of the effort and challenges really hit us. The steepness of the initial descent into a realization, into this realization of the challenge can cause feelings of despair. This is the phase where leadership is crucial to manage morale and maintain momentum. Our goal as change leaders is to reduce the pitch, and we need to ask ourselves, how can we make this transition smoother, right? Level setting expectations from the start so it's not as steep. Working through deep planning around various scenarios and risk mitigation up front can reduce that pitch. But in addition, we need to minimize the depth, right? In the depths of the change process, it's common for us to experience the lowest morale. This is where we encounter the greatest resistance, fatigue, and the question is, how do we minimize that, right? Strong leadership, clear communication, and creating a supportive culture are key, which we'll define in what that could look like in the putting into concepts. But at a certain point, there's you start to kind of overcome that despair element. You're seeing the path to success, as we call it. You know, as you climb out of that trough, we can begin to see hard and soft evidence of improvement. It's the light at the end of the tunnel. Now it's about lessening the duration of the tough times. How quickly can we move from understanding the problem to implementing solutions? This is where quick wins, or you hear the idea symptoms of progress, Folks need to see and feel and hear symptoms that progress is being made, whatever progress means for that particular change. And so ultimately, when you're in the pit of despair, it really comes down to 4 core things to get you out of there to lessen the duration and minimize the depth. You engage stakeholders actively and regularly that are impacted by said change, effective communications, which we can dive into a little bit more of what I mean by that, and then get quick wins and build skills that help your organization increase its resilience to said pit. Any questions on that before I jump to solutions? All right. All right. So noting that I wasn't just going to tell you all the problems, right? VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. It's guaranteed. Great, Mitch. Thanks. That sounds awful. But there's antidotes to all of these things. To volatility, it's vision. To uncertainty, it's understanding. To complexity, it's clarity. To ambiguity, it's agility. Your role as a leader is to align, as you observe these things, to identify where you can begin to align and produce antidotes. Right? So let's talk about vision and purpose to start. Painting a compelling picture of the vision and strategy motivates others to action. When faced with ongoing uncertainty and change, people look for something they can hold on to, believe in, aspire towards. They want to know that what they do matters, that they're contributing to something worthwhile, larger than themselves. A sound purpose and inspired vision, whether for an organization, a team, a project, initiative, that's what fuels commitment and unified efforts. And so people are more engaged when they understand how what they do connects to the big picture. They make better decisions when they know where they're headed. They're more resilient when setbacks occur, knowing they're on the right path. To influence others to pursue a meaningful direction, you've got to work to create a vision of a future you want to achieve together, a future that captivates the group's imagination to a large degree. And if that vision isn't inspiring to you on a personal level, it likely won't light any fires in others either. So if you are passionate about the purpose, about closing the gap between whatever your current reality is and the future you desire, then you still need to find a way to ignite the passion in others. Shape and deliver a message that appeals to their core interests or values of your particular audience and or team. But words alone really aren't enough. You need to demonstrate your commitment to that purpose and vision you espouse. And so this will inspire others to show their commitment as well. There's a few activities or really tools in the toolkit, one of which we'll speak about here, but this comes to clarification of purpose and team values, which can be as large as an organization-wide initiative or as small as a facilitated conversation with your team. Stating intentions and envisioning and vision setting for shorter periods and goals is also important. And we'll talk about an activity I've used and found success in to center teams through volatile times, and then shaping the mindset around desired outcomes versus problems. It's important to understand what the problems are, but problems alone tend to not be motivating. Hope inspires action, dread inspires inaction. And so focusing on outcomes and where those quote unquote symptoms of progress are going to come from up front is going to help you sustain momentum through volatility. Uncertainty, going to sort of touch on both ambiguity and uncertainty in the same vein here. But you address uncertainty, simply put, by building understanding, right? Whether at work or off work, people are going to be constantly facing situations that are ambiguous or uncertain. There's that means there's not a clear understanding of what the problem is, or quite frankly, what the solution is. Where the unknown outweighs the known by a wide margin. And some studies estimate near that as much as 90% of what managers deal with is at least somewhat ambiguous. So new demands, new technology, new marching orders, new processes, new coalitions, new partners, nothing lasts very long. In an era where clarity is scarce and certainty is fleeting, relying on solutions that have worked in the past may seem safe, but in some regards is actually pretty risky. New times require new solutions. And so solving problems and getting things done in this volatile context means being willing to forge ahead with a path that is foggy at best, and it means adjusting your approach to both problems and people to match these changing conditions. And so the world is getting less and less predictable. So having a mindset geared towards viewing uncertainty as the new normal will better prepare you for the next unknown. And so as an antidote to uncertainty, a lot of it's around getting organized. What information already exists? What has the problem, or what is the problem? Gather data on who, what, when, where, why the problem occurs. Is it sporadic? Is it chronic? Is it mild? Is it severe? Shine a light on the fog with a goal of differentiating the information you receive back between facts, opinions, and guesses. Ultimately, we look at there's certain just behaviors as a leader around asking questions, speaking less, active listening that I'm sure many of you have heard before. But in addition to that, seeking input from multiple sources and triangulating. I believe that the uncertainty and ambiguity we're experiencing and the shifts in our environment is directly connected to increased community and stakeholder engagement, right? We're bringing other people into the fold, and we should continue to do that. Using different lenses to broaden our perspective of a problem. So there's a lot of different frameworks out there. Probably the most well-known is SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I'll introduce a few others today that you can use to center discussion around viewing an issue or a solution from multiple perspectives and lenses. And then there's creating a learning environment, which we'll unpack. And then lastly, I want to touch on agility. One of the elements is do, learn, course correct. Oftentimes we are in a position where we're going to have to make decisions without having 100% of the answers. In the environment we're in now, it's best to do, learn, and course correct. What I mean by that is the best plan is action, right? And committing to taking action, making sure you learn from that and monitor that, right? Because we don't want to just ignorantly take action and accidentally end up causing more harm than good. But that's where the course correct piece comes in. So we'll unpack that a little bit. But lastly, we have complexity. And the antidote to complexity is clarity, right? Problems are getting more complex all the time. Success depends on figuring out the best solution to these difficult and high-stake issues. And so these issues have so many moving parts. It's hard for one person to make sense of them all. And most people are smart enough to solve problems effectively, but they don't always go about it the right way. and they don't define the problem carefully enough, and they rush to conclusions, or they go to the other extreme and analyze it to death and without anything, without trying anything out. And so they may rely on too much of themselves when multiple people usually have a better chance of arriving at the best solution. It's tempting to skim the surface of a thorny issue, but skim the surface solutions will yield superficial results at best and flat out wrong at worst. And so we need to have ways to better drill down, to gather data from diverse sources, sort through it, and then distill it into simpler, more understandable themes. Evaluate the pros and cons of potential solutions and test out best options. So again, these are interconnected, casting a wider net to gain more information, modulating communication to meet audiences' mindset. That just means changing your communications to meet your audience where it's at. And then expressing and using visuals and storytelling to communicate complex issues to various stakeholders. And then, of course, seeking and encouraging feedback. These are all tools that we can deploy and practices we can all get better at. For example, I need to get, or one of the areas I'm looking to improve is I often struggle to reduce the complexity when communicating, right? And so finding different ways to improve in terms of storytelling or graphic design and use of visuals in communication is key. Whereas there's others that I feel a bit stronger in. No one person's going to get a scorecard of A pluses along these lines. But as leaders, there's a constant and continuous element around learning. And these are all tools that we can use to combat VUCA in our organizations and on behalf of the folks we share our collective missions with. All right. Any questions on VUCA? Do folks see VUCA showing up in their organizations? All right, move along. All right, so putting some of this into practice. We're not going to be able to kind of dive into the full, just given the virtual element. This is usually a day-long workshop. And so if this is something that you'd want to kind of do some skill building in down the line, express that in your post-event surveys, and we can work with Micah to potentially get something like that set up. But for now, I just want to touch on a few of the tools that I use the most. And then we'll open it up for some questions here. The first I spoke to is stating positive intentions and envisioning for shorter periods of time to combat volatility. There's an activity I refer to as see, hear, feel. I use this with both clients and my own team when there's a lot shifting and moving around them in terms of whatever project they're leading with. And it has been as quick as an hour-long facilitated discussion, or as long as really 4 hours, like a half-day discussion, where we will reduce back down to about 3 months out. So looking no farther than 3 months out. And we'll have a visioning session And it starts by asking, what do you hope to see 3 months out? You know, if we are to continue to move forward with this initiative, this change, what do you see? What types of interactions? What materials are we holding in our hands? What people or teams are enabled that might not be today? Acknowledgement. Um, we'll then map what they hope to hear from leadership conversations, in meetings, in the hallways, from various agencies they work with, from stakeholders, maybe the rumor mill, and then what they hope to feel, right? So, culture, values being exercised, internal senses, experiences, interactions. This is intended to ground uh, some mindfulness within your group. This is often best done with stakeholders, and provides an empathetic lens into what your team and or stakeholders are expecting or sensing with said project or change initiative. And this is something that can be done virtually or old school with butcher block paper on the walls and sticky notes. It's easily adapted, and oftentimes I simply use this slide here and just clear the text from it, and we can just add things right in there. So simple tool. Again, the intent is to develop a deeper understanding of your team and or stakeholders' expectations for the future, and really keep those in short line, not 6 months, not a year out. We're really talking year to 3 months here. For uncertainty, oftentimes with significant amount of uncertainty, we struggle with where do we start? When uncertainty is within our control, we need to make a decision about something. The stress feels more manageable. To manage ambiguity and uncertainty, we have to kind of take stock of what's within our control and what's without our control. But really here, for at least half, if you're not sure where to start, you always should default to defining the problem. If for at least half of the time allotted to deal with a problem, you've sort of got to shut off your solution machine and get clear on what needs fixing. I think it was Albert Einstein once said that if he had an hour to save the world, he'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes finding the solution. Rigor in problem definition pays off in better solutions. So to start by defining what the problem is, and more importantly, what the problem isn't, and be clear and be as clear and succinct as possible. Why is it important to solve? How would clients, stakeholders, your organization, or others benefit from said problem being solved? What is the goal? Or write a desired outcome statement that describes what will be better if the problem is solved. Keep in mind that problem definition may not be a once and done proposition. Complex issues evolve quickly, so revisit the problem definition over time, so you're still solving for the right problem. This is also a great space to involve other stakeholders to quote unquote triangulate information. Making sure, especially in the how do you put this? The context of coalitions and networked organizations, making sure you're aligned on what your target is key. And so if you're stuck in paralysis in terms of action or kind of where to go next, default to problem defining. And, ooh, there we go. It's supposed to be like that. Whether you're evaluating a problem or a solution, you can use different lenses to assess a particular problem. Personally, and I'm going to speed up here because of time. Personally, this is one of my favorites that I default to, whether it's an internal issue or an external issue. You can begin to evaluate it from the perspective of people, process, technology. You know, on the right here, we have people, process, technology, structure. Those are internal to our organization. You can look at things like what talent or human capital constraints you currently have that would impact said change or problem. You can look at processes, right? So where are there bottlenecks, customer service breakdowns that inhibit our ability to promote said change. Technology, what role does it play or not play? And then structure, right? Are we structurally set up to enable the change we want? Then externally, you can look at things like regulations. Is this change we're trying to affect even legislatively permissible? You know, regulations could also be your internal org rules and regulations, but in this context, I'm thinking about kind of community jurisdictions. Funding, the F word for our organizations. You know, will there be funds that are appropriate for this? Who's going to fund it? What's going to fund it? What are the constraints of those funding? We also have to ask ourselves political and public sentiment. So do we have community support on this? If you can't answer that question, that's a great node for engagement. And then span of control, right? So is what we're trying to change even within our scope of control? And you can ask yourself that personally as an individual, or you can ask it on behalf of your organization. So there's a lot of different frameworks that we can use to center conversations and facilitate a discussion to address said problem. And as we navigate through uncertainty, it's imperative that we ground our actions in a deep and shared understanding. And so this is where the principle of everyone matters comes into sharp focus. Our goal isn't just to achieve results, but to ensure that the quality of our decisions and actions reflects the collective intelligence and consideration of your entire group. Right? This goes to the concept of inclusion. In the face of uncertainty, it's crucial that we don't rush to conclusions and act on limited perspectives. And so instead, you need to seek input from multiple sources, listening intently to each stakeholder. And then, you know, this approach is often referred to as triangulation. I've been referring to it as triangulation. There's a book by Nancy Klein called Time to Think that emphasizes the importance of creating thinking environments where everyone's voice is not only heard, but is generally valued. It's about listening to ignite the human mind, she says. When we truly listen to one another, we unlock new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. And so in this context, you know, the key points that Nancy drives home here is that everything we do begins with thinking, and you need to have reflective conversations with yourself as a leader about when do you do your best thinking? What does that environment look like? Oftentimes, good thinking is determined by how people are treated and while they are thinking. And so to create a thinking environment, he lays out some things that you can do as a leader that are rather actionable in terms of the environment you set up. The key here is that oftentimes clear thinking is seen as a second, or as a product of, um, we just meet and we have these meetings, but there's a lack of intentionality that goes into them. But to truly create a thinking environment, it requires a level of intentionality that isn't just throwing a meeting onto a calendar, right? Making sure we have um, an environment where there's no interruptions, that offers us freedom from rush and urgency isn't always easy to do. But nevertheless, everything is going to come back to this. And so, again, not going to elaborate too much. There's facilitated exercises we could do on this. Highly recommend her book. It's a pretty light read, and that's coming from a guy with dyslexia. So more to come on that. Happy to answer any questions. Then there's the wear different hats. This is another framework, right? It's inspired by Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats method, which helps us deliberately adopt a variety of different perspectives on a given subject. So you would walk through a particular issue, and step 1 is you focus on everyone wears the white hat, right? Which is you begin by donning and focusing solely on facts and data. What's objective here about said project, problem, or change. You then switch to the yellow hat, which you take an optimistic view, focusing on potential benefits and values. Then the red hat, which focuses in on expressing intuitions and reactions and emotions. The black hat, where you focus in on potential drawbacks or cost benefits and trade-offs. The green hat focuses on creativity. Blue hat focuses on control. The idea is that you can have a structured conversation about a particular issue with either yourself and or a larger group that runs you through summarizing your findings on a particular issue from various perspectives. Because left alone, left without the structure, people in groups will likely not do that. And then I had to drop this in here because it's hard. Again, this is another area where we could really workshop and skill build, but messaging around change, I want to touch on. I'm going to use 3 minutes, so we leave about 10 for Q&A. I want to leave with some kind of high level tips on communicating change, because this is where it's difficult, but in my time, I've learned a few things, and one is that messages need to appeal to hope and not fear. That speaks to that idea of hope, and hopeful messages and optimistic messages promotes action behaviorally, whereas fear promotes inaction and closes people down. And we're trying to change behaviors and change the ways we're working. And so we need people to take action. In addition to that, we need to mitigate the desire for simple solutions. Oftentimes, we like to pad our messaging with, simplicity, worried that if folks don't feel it's simple or there's a clear answer, then they won't engage with it. But the reality is we need to build a tolerance for ambiguity. You can acknowledge that there's a solution and a path forward while still acknowledging that complexity is real, right? And call it out. That, because quite frankly, we know now we have a VUCA mindset. We know that complexity is going to be around us no matter what we do, right? And so acknowledge that authentically. instill confidence that the impacted work areas or other goals of a change process will require stakeholders to learn and adapt. Reinforce that future sustainability depends on doing work in a new way, and then build organizational resilience through skill building. I mean, those are core elements. Fundamentally, though, communicating during a change initiative should involve specifying the nature of the change, explaining why it's occurring, explaining the scope of it, developing a graphic representation of the change initiative that all employees, regardless of their background, can understand, predict the negative aspects of implementation, explain the criteria of success and how success will be measured, hashtag symptoms of progress, explain how people will be rewarded for that success, and then repeat the purpose for the change and the actions plan. And then make sure that we're using a diverse set of communication styles that are appropriate. And then make communication a two-way proposition. Any and every change initiative needs to have bi-directional dialogue between those being asked to change or forced to change and those commissioning said change. And so change is rarely simple. You know, there lies a story that awaits to be told, and that story can galvanize action towards transformation. What you see up on the screen is just a prompt that I wanted to make sure that everybody had, that I still use regularly to create change journey stories for storytelling purposes. So I wanted to make sure folks had that as a reference kind of going out. And then, yeah, to sum it up, complexity is real. It's part of the work we do. It's not going anywhere. If you don't know where to begin by experimenting with small steps. You know, if you imagine that the lights suddenly go out, what do? You feel your way around until your eyes adjust, right? You reach for the light. Embarking on any new change or venture means that you're gonna have to act on ambiguous problems where there might not be any precedent to follow similar. So experiment and or begin to clearly define the problem. The journey to the unknowns is ever shifting and changing. So again, focus on do, learn, adjust. Mindset and people dynamics require considerable investment, right? Management is one piece, processes is one piece, technology is one piece, but the people and developing and investing in leadership development is critical. And then change is required of change leaders and the stakeholders. And after talking for an hour and a half, I get to say that's it.